Welcome back. Many of you may remember your parents or grandparents talking about the dirty 30s, a decade of economic disasters, drought, dust storms, and crop failures. The Depression, they called it. Stories of hard times, no money, and making do. Yet as the 1930s unfolded, many of our family's first Canadian-born generation tossed caution to the wind, got married, and started their families. On the other side of the world, most of our family's relatives in Galiciantal were chafing under Polish rule, their vanquished Austrian overlords ousted by the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. And as Hitler rose to power through the 1930s, none of our family could have predicted that the end of the decade would also mean the end of their century in the Śmierzanka Valley. The story of the 1930s actually begins in 1929 with a worldwide stock market crash. From 1929 to 1932, the Canadian stock market lost about half its value, but the U.S. market fared much worse, dropping a catastrophic 89%. By the late 1920s, the stock market had become a get-rich-quick frenzy as people from all walks of life were frantically buying shares. Banks were so confident in the markets that they offered loans secured by the stocks. Buy a stock for cash, then borrow against the stock and buy more stock, and so on. And when the market crashed, the stocks lost their value, people defaulted on their loans, and 9,000 U.S. banks failed. In Canada, however, thanks to a more diversified nationwide banking system, no banks failed. But the crash was only one component of the economic disaster. Others included drought, crop failure, low grain prices, and human intervention. Initially, U.S. President Hoover and Canadian Prime Minister R.B. Bennett underestimated the scope of the crisis, and both responded by tightening cash and imposing protectionist tariffs on international trade. As bad an idea then as it is now. Unemployment exploded, reaching 24% by 1933. Thousands were out of work. Men rode boxcars west to work for food as laborers on farms, and thousands lined up at soup kitchens across the country. Prime Minister Bennett, a multimillionaire whose wealth escaped the crash, thought the crisis was exaggerated and that it would all blow over. When people wrote to him in desperation, he would send them a $5 bill from his own pocket. Later in the decade, he realized the depth of the crisis and tried to copy President Roosevelt's New Deal by launching public works programs, developing national parks, for example. Bennett eventually set up relief camps where workers lived, ate, and worked for 20 cents a day. I recall older relatives talking disparagingly about people who took relief or went on relief. Apparently, our family was too proud to accept charity, but talk is cheap. In fact, our family was relatively well off, and this talk smacked of arrogance then, as it does now. Bennett also established a maximum work week and set minimum wages, but his policies were seen as too little, too late. The infamous Bennett buggies, cars pulled by horses because no one could afford fuel, mocked the Prime Minister, who was defeated in 1935 by William Lyon Mackenzie King, who extended the Canadian New Deal by creating the Bank of Canada and the CBC, among other nation-building programs. A depression is effectively a steep recession that lasts for years. But as President Harry Truman once said, when your neighbor loses his job, it's a recession. When you lose your job, it's a depression. In a way, this was true of many of our families in Saskatchewan, as most were farmers who wouldn't lose their jobs, but whose livelihood was at risk from another scourge of the dirty 30s, drought. Southern areas of Saskatchewan fared worse than those farther north, But even if your area was lucky enough to get rain, the value of wheat had dropped 600% since 1919 and was now going for 38 cents a bushel in 1932. The drought was exacerbated by misguided farming methods. The now outdated practice of what we called summer following removed protective plants that could hold the soil in place, and there were few hedgerows to shield the fields from erosion. 20 years of growing grain had greatly depleted the topsoil, often just a few inches deep on the prairies. So, when the soil dried out and the wind blew, it piled up at fence lines like snowdrifts. The skies turned dark, and soil that had lain undisturbed for millions of years took flight, floating across Canada and as far as Europe, where it settled on ships and cars. In England, it was known as red snow. Dad's father, Max, continued to farm the section near Surath, but the drought pressed him to the limit. Edward Lang tells of he and his brothers being sent there to pick stones off the land, a thankless job at the best of times.
We were down there, I remember, to go down to Easter to pick stones and get out on the field, and the wind would come up that you couldn't see your face in front of your eyes. We'd go back to your phone and said to Dad, we can't pick stones, we can't see them. We couldn't grow any crops anymore. I think he gave it away for taxes.
After a series of crop failures, Max let those 640 acres go for taxes, while keeping the 2-quarter sections at the family home near Raymore. Nothing discourages youth, however. In 1932, as the worst of the dirty 30s swirled around them, my parents, John and Ann Lang, informed their parents that they wished to be married. As the eldest, Dad was allowed to drive the old Model T to deliver cream to Raymore.
That was a 1919 Model T Roadster without a top on it. Got that for a horse.
See? A horse trainer.
That wasn't bought or got, for me to go courting with, That became a useful vehicle
for hauling hay
to transport us to the other farm, which was 8 miles away. Wasn't that hard to be courting a girl in those days?
Why is that?
Well, because
25 cents took you into the dance, and if the girl brought the lunch, she got in free.
Some of you may have wondered about this courtship between two Langs, as you've been told many times that their parents, Frank and Max, were first cousins. You were right to wonder. First, remember that our family's community in the Raymore and Quinton area was something of a religious, cultural, language island. Our Catholic relatives tended to hang together in church and social gatherings. And if you recall the sheer numbers of first, second, and third cousins in this group, you won't be surprised that from time to time, cousins married. Although it was rare, the law then, as now, allows first and second cousins to marry, although the Catholic Church requires a bishop's dispensation for second cousins, which my parents sought and received. I once asked Mom why she married Dad, her second cousin, and not Philip Shindelka. She replied, chuckling, "Philip was also my second cousin." A whole swack of the first generation born in Canada was now approaching marrying age, and it seems most of them showed up for my parents' wedding on April 12, 1932. Mom and Dad were married in the church their parents helped build, and they partied in Wallenstein School, also helped into existence by their elders. It was very warm that afternoon, 75 degrees Fahrenheit or 24 Celsius, a foretaste of the hot, dry summer to come. After church, the younger generation left the old folks at Max and Terezia's farm and wandered the short walk over to the neighbors, Max's previous farmstead up to 1919. And someone, bless them, took a few pictures, snapshots of the children of the homesteaders, most of them now all grown up. Here is Gabe Lang, a neighbor Lang who, incredibly, was not related to the other Langs. Here's his sister Margaret, who would later marry Lee Degelman. Ernie Lang, who became a barber to the stars in Hollywood. Wenzel Lang, Mom's oldest sibling. Here's Fern, son of Max, with a bandaged hand, his prize for attempting to refill a cigarette lighter with gasoline, according to his brother Edward, seen here. This is Helen Lang, daughter of Lawrence, Mom's uncle, and her good friend Martha Lang, Mom's little sister. Carl Hinger, Dad's cousin on his mother's side, and Mom's cousin on her mother's side. I know, it's complicated. Rose Lang, Mom's oldest sister, and Rose Lang, Dad's younger sister. It gets ridiculous. Peeking out here is Seraphine Ullman, recently married to Wenzel Lang. Next, the newlyweds, then Bill Lawrence Lang, Rudy Lang, Mom's brother. This is Joe Lang, Mom's first cousin, son of Joseph Lang, and his sister Lucy, who traveled from Winnipeg for the wedding. Here's the wedding party, all Langs, Joe, Bill, Rose, Ann, John, Rose again, Lawrence, and a man I do not know. Now I asked Mom about this picture. What the what? She laughed and said they happened to be posing behind a pig trough, and there was a honey can lying there with some water in it. Gabe said, "Let's slop the hogs," and poured it into the trough. Upper left is Dad's sister Agnes, and here's Mom's sister Martha again, Mom's maid of honor, her cousin Lucy, and Mom sitting on Bill Lawrence Lang's knee, then Dad, Carl Hinger, and Bill Lang's daughter Ida. 2 years later, Gabe Lang, once again no relation, married Zita Lang, Dad's sister. In an odd twist I mentioned in a previous video, Gabe was in the room when Zita was born. You see, Gabe's mother Teresa was a midwife who helped deliver dozens of children, including Zita. Her fee, apparently, was 2 bushels of seed grain. More weddings. Dad's brother Bill married Anna Gursky a year or 2 later, and the party included, left to right, Carl, Ida, Bill, Anna, Agnes, and Joe Lang, son of Bill. And in the wide shot you see the usual suspects. And so it went for all the weddings in those days. Everybody showed up, even when the newlyweds were no relation whatsoever. Note the same faces at the 1933 marriage of Charles Fisher and Augusta Holterman, our family's lifelong friends and neighbors. A couple of new faces, including Molly Hilleman, daughter of John Holterman's homestead partner, Herman Hilleman. Farmland was cheap in those days, but cash was scarce, and many farmers defaulted on their loans and municipal taxes. Dad had his eye on Northwest and Northeast Section 15, which was C&R land until the 1920s, when Peter Dittrich took it over and built a house and outbuildings. He eventually put it up for sale, intending his daughter Mary and husband Philip Hartle to buy it. Max Trotsky at Raymore played a role in what transpired next. Apparently, Max Lang convinced Trotsky to sell it to my parents instead, and when the deal was consummated at the land office in Winnipeg, Mary Hartle in particular was not pleased. Some ill will among these relatives persisted for a time, but they remained good neighbors and friends to the end, despite the kerfuffle. And by the way, that land is now farmed by Philip and Mary's grandson, Larry Hartle. The house Peter Dittrich left them was large, with lots of windows, Mom said.
A large house, a big one though.
How big?
2 bedrooms and a big, large living room and a large kitchen. And a lot of windows.
In this rare photo of that house, you see my sister Lorraine holding the reins while my mother looks out the window. Made of lime-coated mud and sticks, it was also infested with rats. Mom said they hung their flour bag on a wire from the ceiling to protect it from the vermin, and when a rat bit Dad's toe one night, that was the last straw.
In 1939, we pulled the old house down and used all the material that was usable, and then the first part of that house cost me $460.
Marriage leads to babies. Mom's brother Wenzel and bride Seraphine Ullman's son Ralph was among the first. Then Frances, daughter of Mary Lang Kriegel, that's my sister Lorraine. And then Ed Lang, son of Bill and Anna. Dolores Lang, Gabe and Zita's firstborn, and their son Lionel. My brother Lynn, and many more, all born in the dirty 30s. The newest generation arrived just as the oldest was leaving. The 1930s were also the end of the line for Ferdinand and Katharina Lang. Ferdinand missed the Depression and its hardships, passing away on February 3, 1930 at the age of 73. According to his grandson Edward Lang, he died of prostate-related problems. Katharina survived her husband by 8 years, passing away in 1938. Meanwhile, Mom's grandmother, Margareta Rice, had already passed away in 1927 in Odessa, Saskatchewan, aged 92. And Louisa Lang, Bill Lawrence Lang's sister, died young, 2 weeks after my parents' wedding of what they called dropsy, and today is known as congestive heart failure or chronic venous insufficiency. Back in Felicienthal, my mother's grandmother, Anna or Mariana Hofmeister Lang, passed away on January 17, 1937, at the age of 91. Her husband Michael lived another 3 years and died in Poland. Many of our ancestors lived long lives, some well into their 90s. While some lived very short lives. Infant deaths were tragically common before vaccines for many childhood diseases became available. Max and Terezia's last child, their 11th, lived just a few months and died in late 1929. Others survived serious health issues, like Grandpa Frank with the Spanish flu and Grandma Terezia with gallstones. And Max had prostate problems. He survived a botched prostate surgery by traveling to Winnipeg, where a pair of surgeons saved him. The 30s were dirty, but not all was doom and gloom. Among other notable events of the decade, as covered in some detail in episode 10, Max started making violins in 1934. By 1939, he had made enough of them to outfit a family band, or orchestra as they called them back then, and he booked the Fiddlin' Fools to play every Saturday night at the Raymore Hotel. Again, all of this is detailed in a previous episode. In 1935, Frank and Agatha's house burned to the ground, taking the family's heirlooms and its prized piano, seen in the background in this photo. In a bizarre twist, the kitchen stove fell through the floor and landed in the basement, and when they built the new house on the same foundation, the stove became the furnace. True story. Meanwhile, in Europe, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 1933, and in November of that year he was elected to power with 92% of the vote. Right around the time my mother's sister Rose arrived in Germany with plans to stay. Rose had fallen for a tall, thin Kurt Langenfeld, a German who showed up in Saskatchewan around 1932 with his good buddy Hans Gensches. Hans had finished his degree in agriculture and was keen on becoming a prairie farmer. Kurt had a business education with a desire to return to Germany to run a small business and to take Rose with him. Hans traveled with them to Krefeld, Germany, near Cologne, where Kurt's family lived and where Hans's parents owned a restaurant. Rose and Kurt were married on February 3, 1934, in a side altar of the famed Cologne Cathedral, after which they became shopkeepers of a small store in Krefeld. Hans returned to Saskatchewan, where he eventually began farming in the Humboldt area. The newlyweds could not have chosen a worse time to locate in Germany, as Hitler's brown shirts began appearing on the streets in the Rhineland, which was declared neutral territory after World War I. As they were not proper soldiers, they were not sanctioned for roaming the streets, berating Jews and spewing Hitler's racist and xenophobic propaganda. Rose and Kurt had several Jewish friends and customers, and they were increasingly harassed by the brown shirts who told them to keep better company. They watched with growing anxiety as Hitler dissolved state governments, consolidated the police forces under his command, and began isolating Jews, Roma, or Gypsies as they were called, invalids, and intellectuals. In 1937, when Rose had finished posting a letter, she turned to leave the post office when the postmistress shouted, "Aren't you forgetting something?" Rose turned around to see the woman raise her arm and shout, "Heil Hitler!" Disgusted, Rose wrote home saying she was leaving, and she felt so sad that as she wrote, "I could write this letter with my tears." The couple returned to Saskatchewan shortly before Hitler annexed Austria and the Sudetenland, also known as West Bohemia, our family's ancestral homeland. A footnote. Rose and Kurt bought and ran a store in Lemberg, Saskatchewan until 1948, when Kurt died of congenital liver failure. After a few years, Rose married again, this time to Hans Gensches, Kurt's best friend. The end of the 1930s was also the end of the German Bohemians' time in Felicienthal and its sister villages. In late 1939, after Hitler's Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, blew through Polish forces to take over Poland, his short-lived Soviet allies moved in from the east to occupy what is now West Ukraine. Many in our family were hoping Hitler would free them from the hated Polish occupation. Their children were now being educated in Polish rather than German, so they'd hoped Hitler would restore their lost language rights. But when the army rolled into Felicienthal, it was Soviet, not German. In an odd democratic twist, in late December of 1939, all the residents were invited to vote on whether to stay in their villages under Soviet rule or be moved to Heims im Reich, or back home to the Empire. No one was interested in option A. Hundreds of Felicienthalers, Annabergers, and Karlsdorfers gathered their belongings and began a trek by wagon, on foot, and by train, but not, as they'd hoped, to Germany. Their destination turned out to be an internment camp in Lodz, Poland, which, now occupied by Germany, was considered part of Germany, part of the Reich. When Great Britain declared war in 1914, Canada was automatically included. But after distinguishing itself in World War I, Canada had earned the autonomous right to declare war on its own, which it did on September 10th, 1939, 1 week after Britain. For months, nothing seemed to happen, and while the fiddlin' fools entertained at the Raymore Hotel, many joked about the phony war, which became very real, very fast. And that, my friends, is the subject of the next episode, Casualties of War, in which geopolitics once again made us the enemy of our European relatives. Thanks for watching.